On the 14th of August 1936, 75,000 spectators packed the shores of the Langer Sea, a lake situated just on the outskirts of Berlin. Among this crowd was Adolf Hitler, accompanied by his entourage, greeted by cheers and salutes from a German crowd upon arrival. They were there for one of the blue-ribboned events of the 1936 Summer Olympic Games, the most important event in rowing, the final of the men's eight. Germany had already won gold in 5 of the 6 rowing events that morning, and lined up against the elite European crews was an unlikely crew from the University of Washington, comprised of 9 working-class young men from the Pacific Northwest. Against the odds, these 9 American undergraduate students, who were all sons of labourers, defeated Hitler's prized rowing team in the final. This was perhaps the peak of rowing's history, and indeed popularity, in the USA. In this documentary, I explore how the sport of crew has acted as a microcosm of American identity from antiquity to the modern era. From the beginnings in the early 1800s to the working-class triumph of the 1936 Boys in the Boats, to the gender equity revolution sparked by Title IX, rowing has existed as a constant throughout history in an ever-changing country. Chapter 1: Immigration and Identity, 1800 to 1935. Going back to the very beginning, in the 19th century, America was very different. There was westward expansion, industrial growth, and inflow of immigrants to the land of the free in search of better life. Rowing was no different to these trends. In cities, immigrant rowing clubs began to appear. There were Polish, Irish, and Jewish organizations, explained by the 5-fold jump in urban populace between 1820 to 1850 that we touched on in class under the key term urbanization. Here we can see that America was a land of many different identities, with a great deal of affinity for its roots. This example also illustrates that throughout history, marginalized groups have had to create their own spaces in the USA, as we saw with Seneca Village in 1825. Chapter 2: Meritocracy and Grit, 1936 to 1945. But, in the emerging age of mass media, newspapers were thrilled to share the story of the so-called boys in the boat with the wider public. The nation turned the 9 athletes, the 8 oarsmen and coxswain, into celebrities. Papers sold the story of humble American boys conquering elitism, fascism, and fate with nothing but grit and teamwork. The working-class young men conquered the elite Ivy Leagues, including Princeton, at the final Olympic trials. They then subsequently beat the finest elite athletes the rest of the world had to offer. I would argue this story getting such national recognition showed the ideals of the country at the time, a celebration of what was important to the nation. Rooting for the underdog, meritocracy, and never give up attitude, and beating the looming fascist threat fairly and squarely. In this course, we saw a similar story that celebrated grit and discipline. Pedestrianism in the late 1800s was also a test of willingness to endure, and was most importantly open to all and celebrated as a meritocracy. The story of the US Olympic men's eight in 1936 pulled on the same heartstrings. Chapter 3: Pale and Male Ivy League Takeover, 1946 to 1971. But, as America entered the post-war era, rowing drifted from a blue-collar triumph to an elite pastime. It became a sport dominated by the Ivy League. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton rowers swanned around regattas in blazers, gliding toward careers in finance, politics, and diplomacy. The elite Henley Royal Regatta in England was an annual all-male spectacle of the finest educational institutions from both sides of the Atlantic. Rowing becoming a characteristic sport of the upper class echoed suburban America's obsession with image and control. Crew became an elite boys' club. Those from elite prep schools could dominate the scene, particularly the healthy and well-fed youth that grew into tall young men. We looked in this course at a film of the time that represented ideals of the era: invasion of the body snatchers. Conformity to the correct group was a goal, and conformity to the wrong group was a nightmare. To row was to conform to the socially celebrated. Crew represented a carefully orchestrated American ideal of the 40s and 50s: white, male, and elite. Chapter 4: Title IX and Drive for Equality, 1972 to modern era. In the 1970s, the male grip on the sport had shifted. Title IX's enactment in 1972 opened rowing and college athletics to female athletes who had been shut out of the story. But, at colleges, gender equality in athletics was far from where it is today. Most notably, at Yale, the women of Yale's varsity crew team were still being denied basic dignity in 1976, 4 years after Title IX should have fixed this. After winter practices on the Housatonic River, the men returned to a heated locker room and hot showers. The women were forced to sit soaked and shivering on the team bus. One day that spring, 19 women marched into the office of Yale's athletic director. They stripped off their warm-up clothes to reveal their protest. Title IX and messages like "I need a shower" were written across their nude bodies in blue marker. Rowing, once a vessel of exclusion, became a stage for feminist resistance and eventually transformation. The women of Yale crew were successful in their protest and were provided with showers and a locker room by the next year. I link this process to the emergence of women adrift between 1880 and 1930. Women who started earning wages were emancipated to some degree, but were still far from equality. In the same way, female athletes in the 70s were helped a great deal by Title IX, but were still far from reaching equality. Men's grip on rowing was broken by independent women. This aspect of rowing's history represents gendered resistance and America's transition to the path to gender equality. Jenny Keisling, a rower on the Yale women's crew at the time, stated in an interview with ESPN in 2012, "What strikes me when I go back to the boathouse now is the change in the women rowers themselves. When we rowed crew, we didn't quite know how to balance being jocks and women at the same time. Now, I see these women who are comfortable in both their femininity and their athleticism." I link this protest to the key term respectability politics, an idea that we examined in the course in a racial context. Originally, the rowers of Yale's women's crew conformed to their oppressors' norms and standards. Nowadays, after much activism and social progress has been made, there is less of a need for respectability politics in women's sports. I would draw a link also for this comment to the song "How Lovely to Be a Woman" from the 1998 film Bye Bye Birdie that we looked at in class, a song where femininity was celebrated. Though written with some irony, the idea of celebrated femininity became a more common theme toward the end of the 20th century, and rowing's transition to having a highly competitive women's league reflects this. Today, rowing has fallen into some level of obscurity, but its history provides insight into the USA's culture. From early associations with immigrants and the everyman to the working class triumph of the 1936 Olympic crew to the gender equity protests of the 1970s, the sport has both reinforced and challenged social norms and represented both tradition and transformation. Thank you for listening.